What's up, everybody? Dr. Josh here, clinical psychologist, natural bodybuilder, judge, professor, etc., 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 DBZ enthusiast. Today, we are going to talk about the training mistakes that I made early on in my career so that you all can avoid them. I do not know how much time I wasted doing these things, and after I figured them out, after I fixed them, my training became more efficient and I saw more gains. So, if you're interested in that or anything bodybuilding psychology related, hit subscribe and let's get to the episode. One training mistake that I made early on in my bodybuilding career was not knowing or not even attempting to track training volume. So basically, I would just go in and I would have particular body parts. Maybe you could even consider those on the front burner for each workout. I'd go in, I'd train chest, I'd train chest and back, I'd train arms, I'd train shoulders, I'd train, any given body part. And that's probably early on split up into a body part split. So chest on Monday, back on Tuesday. Oh, look, I didn't insert legs in there because I didn't really emphasize lower body. Different story altogether, but I didn't know how to track training volumes or necessarily the best way to do that. And that's another problem altogether because, sometimes I would wait for things to be optimal or perfect before I would make a change. So in this instance, what I would have done or what I would do if I was beginning bodybuilding is I would begin to track sets and more specifically, hard sets. Now, what's a hard set? A hard set is going to be, well, probably not your warm-ups, although those can count towards your overall training volumes. I think the hard sets are going to elicit the most hypertrophic gains. So focusing on those is probably going to be beneficial in the long run. And by hard sets, I would say anything in the 3 reps in reserve all the way to 0 reps in reserve and possibly beyond. Those are going to be your hard sets. Can you make gains by training farther away from failure? 4 reps in reserve, 5? Yeah, absolutely. But if we're searching for a training program that is somewhat optimal, I would say getting closer to failure and tracking your hard sets should have been something that I was doing a lot sooner. So if we turn this whole thing into a metaphor, let's just say your volume is the engine of your bodybuilding car, and that's the thing that keeps it running. But if you're constantly redlining that engine, things are going to start to break down. So that is the number 2 mistake that I made, and that was not modulating my intensity. So as I said before, I wasn't tracking sets. And to be honest with you, I wasn't tracking the amount of intensity that I was performing on any given set or any given workout. I was just training to failure mostly. And when you're young or you start training around, your mid to late teens and into your early 20s, that's going to be fine. You're going to be able to recover. And on days that you aren't recovered from a particular body part, shoot, maybe you go in and train that body part again anyways. I did that when I was younger. Or if as you sort of progress and get a little bit smarter, maybe you don't train chest again and you shift to legs, give your upper body a rest. I think a lot of the time, especially early on in bodybuilding training, we do what we can get away with until we can't get away with it anymore. And now, or excuse me, I'm going to personalize this a bit. Now I'm dealing with back issues and a little bit of knee issues and maybe even some shoulder issues. And that is the cost of trying to get away with things early on because eventually that will catch up with you. So I think by tracking our volumes and also modulating the intensity, not going to failure every time, is also going to benefit your longevity in the sport of bodybuilding and or just training in general. So if you're not familiar with reps in reserve, that is a style of modulating your intensity for any given set, generally beginning with 3 reps in reserve, after your warm-ups. 3 reps in reserve being you could only do 3 more reps, and then followed by your next set, and you would perform your training for an entire microcycle or week at 3 reps in reserve. And then the following week, you would increase the intensity and perform most of your exercises, if not all of your exercises, with 2 reps in reserve. 2 reps being, I could only do 2 more. And then next week, 1 rep in reserve, and then the following week, 0 reps in reserve. So in this way, while you are progressing sets, while you are progressing volume, you are also progressing intensity. And I think this is a powerful thing to do, especially if you're a slightly older trainee, if you're in your mid-20s to mid-30s and maybe even beyond, by modulating your intensities along with your ever-increasing volumes, which they'll cap out at a certain point too, you begin to respect the fact that you don't have an infinite battery and you might take longer to recover. So with reps in reserve, remember, just like progressing your sets and your total volumes, you're going to want to progress the intensity that you do across a mesocycle and across macrocycles. But there are going to be times when you want to train beyond failure. Maybe you want to do some drop sets. Maybe you want to do some other intensity techniques. However, that was mistake number 3. I sort of prioritized those failure techniques as opposed to true progression. So I focused on intensity techniques, drop sets, supersets, rest pause, anything you name, I probably tried it. I even had this one technique where on a selectorized piece of bench press equipment, I would have all of it on the concentric part of the motion, and then I had a buddy push back down on the handles for the eccentric. Now this was a fine technique, and I felt, dude, my chest felt trashed afterwards, but I didn't focus on my volumes. I didn't track my volumes. I didn't track my intensities. The thing that I was focusing on here was sort of that feel, that sort of muscle damage feel, when I think the thing to focus on is your overall sets and the amount of mechanical tension you can put your muscle through. The thing I didn't see is by training in that fashion, maybe I wasn't getting in the quality amount of sets that I could have been getting in, and I was just focusing on a feel. And I think that's a lot of the early on training mistakes that I made, was I was so focused on an acute feeling that it didn't allow for a broader look at what, if I had specific training goals aside from just getting huge, it didn't allow me to focus on broader goals that would mean more long-term gains. So for me, focusing on hard compound sets for most of my major body parts is what I focus on. Most of those intensity techniques are going to be saved for maybe mesocycle 2 or mesocycle 3 when I'm getting ready to take a break. Now, let's just say at some point I learned that intensity wasn't everything, but I was still sort of chasing this novelty, and that led to my next mistake, which was switching exercises too frequently. Oh, as I was saying, I would switch exercises too frequently. Now, what is too frequently? Sometimes I would go week to week and I would switch out multiple exercises. Now, I'd like to think that I was smart enough to maintain most of my compound lifts throughout even just a mesocycle. So for 4 weeks, bare minimum, I was keeping a lot of the same compound lifts. However, even for my sort of minor lifts or body parts that were on the back burner, I'm pretty sure I would swap out a lot of my arm training from honestly week to week to week, just because the way something felt. Now, I think you should take into account how something feels. Is there a ton of joint pain? If there's a ton of joint pain and you can't work through it through multiple sets, then should you keep doing that exercise? Well, if you're doing that exercise once a week, maybe you come back and test it the next week, and if it still doesn't feel good there, hey, maybe cut that out. However, I wasn't even going off that. I was chasing novelty. And I think a lot of the times early on in training, especially as like beginner bodybuilders, you chase novelty or that feeling. It's almost like chasing that dopamine rush, which is sort of what gets people hooked at casinos. You are chasing something new when slow progression with specific exercises that you stick to for a number of weeks and possibly even months. If you're getting stronger in those exercises, whether that's through repetitions or adding weight, that is going to be the way to go for proper progression. So for me, for my compound lifts, I keep those in for 2 to 3 mesocycles. And if I'm still gaining, I might keep them for longer than that. For minor lifts, I try and keep the minor lifts, like let's say a barbell curl versus a dumbbell curl. I'll keep that in for an entire mesocycle as long as it's not messing with my joints. And I'll keep it for longer if I continue to progress in load or in reps in whatever sort of rep scheme I'm using. All right, now I think sort of what we're crescendoing to and what we've sort of built up to is that consistency matters. Consistency in tracking your sets, consistency in sort of your progression of intensity, consistency with the types of exercises, equipment that you tend to use, but consistency with who you train with or who you shouldn't train with. I was in the bad habit early on of listening to my big friends, and I think this is a trap that we can all sort of fall into. Is you see your big friend at the gym, or if he's not your friend, you start paying more attention to what he's doing because he's the big guy. And when you start training with these individuals, you are at their whims in terms of what they're doing in their workouts. Now, if you are an enlightened individual or an individual who has very strong boundary setting skills, it might be easy not to do that. But you know, bodybuilding can sometimes be lonely. And so if we can find training partners or people who can come at the same time that we can be at the gym, that's going to be awesome. And it's going to feel good. And sometimes maybe they want to train body parts in sort of a different fashion than you do. And we then expose ourselves to their desire for novelty, compounded with our desire for novelty, and that's just not going to make for appropriate progression either. So if you want to avoid this mistake, make sure that you and whoever you train with are aligned in your training philosophies, and that way you can both progress in an optimal fashion for yourselves. So if you can avoid all those mistakes, I have no doubt that your training is going to improve exponentially, and if you can keep that up consistently, you're going to progress and possibly extend and prolong your bodybuilding career. So I hope this was helpful, and if it was, hit subscribe, drop a comment about any of the early on sort of training mistakes that maybe you have made and would like to remedy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode.